Hello, this is Professor Leone, and tonight we are talking about ethical egoism, which is chapter 5 in our book, The Elements of Moral Philosophy. Ethical egoism is the philosophy of Ayn Rand, and as you can see, she is a modern, or contemporary is more accurate, philosopher. She died in 1982, and the excerpt that we're reading was written in 1961. So she is writing in contemporary time for philosophy. Uh, she was a novelist as well as a philosopher. A lot of her philosophical ideas come to us in the form of fiction, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged in particular. Um, we can take a look at the movie that was made in 2011 of her uh, book Atlas Shrugged. And in this movie, as in Fountainhead, she takes her philosophy, which she called objectivism. Our textbook refers to it in the more uh, generic name, if you will, and calls it ethical egoism. The underlying idea of ethical egoism is raising the question of something that we often take as an assumption of moral goodness, and that is altruism. Most of the time, when you're saying, "Oh, well, she's a good person. She's really selfless. She gives to others," we take it for granted that being selfless or generous or altruistic is synonymous with being a good person, with goodness. And Ayn Rand very insightfully raises the question, why is that good? When we put ourselves first, when we take care of us first, we call that selfishness. And Ayn Rand takes issue with this. Why is it a bad thing to take care of yourself? That's ridiculous. Self preservation is not bad. Putting your family before the needs of others is not bad, according to Ayn Rand. Now, we are going to, in this chapter, examine if we think she's right or not. Now, this is a relatively contemporary philosophy, and as such, it does play into some very contemporary thinking in politics and social policy. I'm sure you've heard more than a few people advocate that we shouldn't help other people, that poor people are freeloaders, and we should instead not help them so they can pull themselves up by their bootstraps and become stronger. And if they can't do that, if they can't become stronger and self sufficient, well, then they're weak and survival of the fittest, baby, right? Um, this is not a philosophy that I'm advocating. It is a philosophy that Ayn Rand advocates, and it is a philosophy that gets a lot of play in a number of political factions uh, that are very active in our country right now. Okay, so let's look at the text and do a brief analysis. I'm not going to go uh, too far in, uh, but the beginning question is, do we have a duty, a responsibility, a requirement to help the less fortunate, or want to make it more dramatic to clarify it, the starving. If someone is starving to death, what business do we have buying DVD players, concert tickets, iPods, cell phones? It's a really good question. To examine this, we first need to clarify the difference between psychological egoism and ethical egoism. We're looking at ethical egoism, so we have to separate it out from psychological egoism. Psychological egoism is a descriptive, um, what do I want to say, social sciences. It's a part of social sciences, and it is a descriptive uh, system talking about or making the claim that human nature is selfish. Now, that's different saying that you are selfish or that people are naturally selfish. We can come up with lots of examples of that, but that's not the same as saying you ought to be. You should be selfish. Uh, Ethical egoism says you should be selfish. Uh, Traditionally, ethics argues, yeah, human nature, it might be human nature to be selfish, but a moral person overcomes that, right? Either we grow out of it through good parenting or maturity or through religious education, but somehow we learn to share and we learn to put others first, to not always think of ourselves. So that is um, what traditionally morality argues is what you should do. Now, Ayn Rand says, oh, that is completely wrong. Why should a strong person enslave themselves to the weak people who can't take care of themselves? Uh, it is a really good question. Right. Now, our text goes through um, some questions as to whether our human nature, and this is in 5.2, our text talks about whether human nature is altruistic or if it is actually selfish or not. Some people argue that everyone always does what they really want to do, and people that are altruistic or selfless, that spend a lot of their time and energy helping people who are less fortunate than themselves, that they actually do it for themselves because it gives them pleasure to help other people. Um, whether you believe that or not is somewhat inconsequential to this. Um, I want to kind of skip ahead here to get to the arguments for ethical egoism, which are on page 71. In my text, I'm not sure if the current edition has the same. Um, let's look at page, let's see, I have it on page 73. Yes, the arguments for ethical egoism. Let's see what Ayn Rand says. Let's see. I want to find it. And it is, for me, it's her argument is on page 73, but I'm not so sure. Oh, here it is. It's right here. It's on the same page. Okay. Let's make it a little larger. Yeah, it's true. She kind of, because she writes fiction, a lot of philosophers overlook her. And a lot of her ideas are based on free market capitalism, which is how they get pulled into the political sphere, because she doesn't believe in regulating industry capitalism at all. She really believes that we should um, let the strong win and let the weak perish. She would let the poor die. She would let starving people starve. So here's what she says. Her Well, here, let's go back here. Altruism, she thought, leads to a denial of the value of the individual. It says to a person, your life is merely something to be sacrificed. If a man accepts the ethics of altruism, she writes, his first concern is not how to live his life, but how to sacrifice it. Those who promote the ethics of altruism are beneath contempt. They are parasites. Rather than working to build and sustain their own lives, they leech off those who do sustain their own lives. Rand continues, parasites, moochers, looters, brutes, and thugs can be of no value to a human being, nor can he gain any benefit from living in a society geared to their needs, demands, and protections. A society that treats him as a sacrificial animal. That's the successful capitalist, to be real pointed, and penalizes him, the successful wealthy capitalist, for his virtues in order to reward them, the poor, for their vices, their laziness, which means a society based on an ethics of altruism. She does not mean anything as dramatic as dying. The wealthy person, the successful person, is to give up their needs, their desires, their cell phones, their luxury yachts, to take care of people who can't take care of themselves. All right, now if this sounds familiar, yeah, it I'm not going to attach it to particular politicians, but there are a number of contemporary politicians who love to cite how much they love Ayn Rand. And when they do, it is code for saying that we should let the wealthy become wealthier and the poor die. It really is that brute. So then on page 74, what then of the hungry children? Yeah. Ethical egoism itself reveals a mind from which the reality of a human being has wiped out, namely the human being who is starving. What will happen to the poor? Ayn Rand replies, if you want to help them, I won't stop you. Go ahead. But she doesn't believe that we have any reason, and this is the crux of her argument here, is mapped out. Each person has only one life. That's all we get. So that life has to be important. It's all you get. The ethics of altruism regards the life of the individual as something to be sacrificed for the good of others. Ethical egoism, right? You're supposed to help other people or help the greater good, right? All the people. Ethical egoism, which allows each person to view his or her own life as having supreme value, does take the individual seriously. It is, in fact, the only philosophy that does. Thus, we should accept ethical egoism. Now, there are, and yes, our text points out very accurately, so now we begin the criticism of it. One problem is that it is what is called a straw man or a false dilemma. Her argument says that we have only two options. Either we are ethical egoists, right? And we follow the objectivism of Ayn Rand, or we are total altruistic saints, like Mother Teresa, giving up everything to help the poor. It's not that polar, right? And I think that's probably someplace in most people's minds. You're like, well, why does it have to be all or nothing, right? Can't we help the starving children without giving up everything? Can I keep my cell phone? So that's what our text refers to as the moderate view, and I think that is in here. Um, what we call the quote unquote common sense view, and you should know I don't like the word common sense because there rarely is any of it. It's not too common. It stands between, we'll call it the moderate view. I prefer that uh, terminology. There is something in between the two extremes. One's own interests and the interests of others are important, and we must strike a balance between them. Sometimes we should act for the sake of others, and at other times we should look after ourselves. So it is a middle ground, and that's mapped out here on page 75 of our text. So I'll let you look at that at your leisure. And then there are some other arguments against uh, ethical egoism in 5.4. And there's three of them here. The first says that ethical egoism is evil or wicked. The second is that it is logically inconsistent. And the third is that it is arbitrary. And the third one is actually very important for our topics this week because we're talking about social justice. And that's where I want to go to here. So, social justice, let me find it. 79. Good. All right. Social justice, or the idea of equality, is simply that it's in our Constitution, right? All men are created equal, or maybe we should say all people are created equal. That idea means that all people should always strive to be fair to everyone. Right? So, what does that really mean? What it means is that we can't give privilege to anyone, including ourselves. We have to look at a situation and say, is everyone getting an equal opportunity here to live their lives? Because when Ayn Rand is talking about unfettered capitalism and let the strong survive and the weak perish, she assumes a level playing field, that everyone's starting at the gate at the same place, and the people who have stronger skills will uh, prosper, and those that have weaker skills will fail and die out. It's a kind of a social evolution. Uh, and so she thinks that that's a good thing. But we don't all start at the same place. Uh, some of us have come from a history of slavery. Some of us have come from a history of sexism. There's all kinds of different hobblings, right? Some of us came up under parents who were either awful people or drug addicted or, a whole slew of disadvantages. And so we don't all have the same opportunities. And the principle of justice, which America in particular is founded on, says that that's not okay. That just letting people duke it out is actually giving preference to some people who have had historically more opportunities than others. Now, that's the principle of justice. It would say that we cannot give preference that way. Now, you can, of course, argue against this and say, well, it's a dog eat dog world. Whoever said life was fair, right? My mother has certainly said that to me at a few times. Um, well, nobody said life was descriptively fair, but that doesn't mean that we want to live in that world. It doesn't mean we give up and say, well, life's not fair. Um, if we hold a principle of justice as a value, then we're going to say, well, life should be fair, and we're going to try to attain that ideal of fairness for everyone. And we can talk at some length in our, what is that? My new thing, the voice thread. We can talk at some length in the voice thread about what that really means to have justice for everyone. Okay, so in this section 5.3, is it 5.3? 5.4, excuse me. 5.4, and the third objection, which is that ethical egoism is unacceptably arbitrary. What that means is that it's not just. And you get about halfway down the page a great description of justice. There's some really good passages in here. Is this where it is? There's a lot of good passages in here, but a great description of justice here. Let's call it there's a general principle that stands in the way of any such justification of putting your own needs before anyone else's. Let's call it the principle of equal treatment. We should treat people in the same way unless there is a good reason not to. In other words, I should grade everybody's papers with the same criteria, the same grading rubric, unless there's some reason not to. Let's say you have a handicap or a reading disability or something, then I might make special concessions for you. That's a legitimate, relevant reason to give special treatment. But short of that, we should give special treatment, or we should treat everybody the same way unless there's a good reason not to. Suppose we're considering whether to admit two students to law school. If both students graduate from college with honors and ace the entrance exam, they're both equally qualified. Then it is arbitrary to admit one but not the other. However, if one graduated with honors and scored well on the admission test while the other dropped out and never took the test, then it is acceptable to admit the first and not the second. Right? So this is the kind of thinking we're doing. When is it acceptable to give special treatment to someone over someone else? This brings us into issues of discrimination, of hiring quotas, of affirmative action, equal rights amendment, a whole slew of social justice issues. I'm not going to go into all of them. There is a great discussion throughout our text that you should look at closely. It makes sense until you get to this question of on page 81. The way that our text is putting it to us, and it's a good way to talk about it. What is the difference between me and everyone else that justifies placing myself in this special category? Why do I get special treatment? What makes it that I can put my own needs before someone else's? What special consideration justifies me putting myself before others? It's a different way to look at altruism. And whether or not you agree with it is the topic for this week's discussion. All right, on that note, I'm going to close because I'm trying to keep these shorter so you have a better chance to actually watch them and stay engaged. Let's take these comments to the voice thread and discuss this article, do your wiki together to outline this and make sure everyone understands this reading, and then we'll take this in our readings on social justice to the voice thread. All right, thank you, everyone.